Good evening, everyone. This is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Forever Knight, Season 3 on DVD. Forever Knight was a TV show that was created by Barney Cohen and James D. Perriott, and it ran from May of 1992 to May of 1996 for a total of 3 seasons. But it actually started off live as a TV movie from 1989 called Nick Knight, wherein the main character, Detective Nicholas, aka Nick Knight, was played by musician Rick Springfield. And it was intended to be a pilot movie for a potential TV series, but nothing ever came of it, so it just remained a TV movie until 1992, wherein the creators were given a green light to do a TV series. And so what they ended up doing was basically working with the production staff to retool the whole thing to where the setting was now in Ontario, Canada, and the cast was completely replaced, because the first 2 episodes of the series were essentially the same story as the TV movie from 1989, just with a different cast, with the exception of John Capellos as Detective Don Skanky. But going forward, though, the main character, Detective Nicholas, aka Nick Knight, was played by actor Geraint Davies, and as Detective Nicholas Knight, he became something of, an iconic protagonist, for late night television, and the show itself became something that had a rather large cult following. But the whole idea of the show initially was that Detective Nicholas Knight, or I should say Nicholas Knight, was an 800-year-old vampire who, after a lifetime of killing, had basically grown remorseful over the years and had wanted to make amends for his many murders throughout the years. I mean, granted, he's a vampire, so he has to kill in order to live, but he basically wanted to make amends for his sins. And fast forward to the 90s, he joins the police department and works on the night shift, under the cover of having a severe allergy to sunlight. And he actually becomes a rather capable detective over time, and enough to where he's well liked amongst the police department, and they forgive him his eccentricities. Obviously, they don't know he's a vampire, but with the exception of one person with the police department, and that's Dr. Natalie Lambert, who is a forensic pathologist who accidentally discovered Nick's secret. And so she's the one person in the police department who knows that he's really a vampire. And the two of them actually ended up becoming friends. And she actually persuaded him to undergo a series of treatments, in order to be able to fight, I guess you could say, his vampiric urges, and hopefully over time become something close to the human he once was. And so Natalie Lambert was played by actress Catherine Disher, and she became a staple of the series and stayed on for all 3 seasons. And another important character was the aforementioned Detective Don Skanky, as played by John Capellos. And he was partnered with Detective Knight, and he was sort of the wisecracking funny man to Nick Knight's, mostly straight man. But that's not to say that Nicholas Knight had no sense of humor. But nonetheless, when it came to, say, like gravitas and pathos, I mean, Nick Knight had the lion's share of it, whereas Skanky, for the most part, had the comedic relief, or comic relief, excuse me. But at the same time, though, as the series went on, John Capellos was able to basically make Detective Skanky his own. I mean, he kept his sense of humor, but there were some episodes here and there where you saw a little more of a serious side, and so as a result, Detective Skanky became a very fleshed out and likable character, especially to the audiences watching the show. And as for Geraint when Davis as Nick Knight, he does a good job of, I should say, he did a good job of balancing, say, the tortured psyche that came with, say, the existence that he had as a vampire. But at the same time, though, there was a sense of optimism that he was able to portray for his character, in a sense that having befriended Dr. Natalie Lambert, there was a chance that he could basically, if not become a straight up human again, at the very least, he could rely less and less on human blood. In fact, as the series started, Dr. Lambert had actually, gotten him to where he was able to basically feed on cow's blood as opposed to human blood. And so progress was being made, albeit slowly, but it was being made. And so the two of them are able to, keep Nick's secret, from everyone in the police department, including Detective Skanky. And at the same time, though, there were several occasions where both Nick and Natalie had to kind of jump through hoops to convince, Detective Skanky that, hey, nothing crazy is going on here, just a wild night, that kind of thing. As far as, say, certain supernatural events, that came about due to, say, vampiric activity. But another fixture of the show was the character of Lacroix, as played by actor Nigel Bennett. And Lacroix was someone who was kind of a frenemy to Detective Knight, because he's actually the one who turned Nicholas Knight into a vampire, all those years ago. And he basically, wanted him to embrace, the wild side of being a vampire, and basically treat humans as cattle, whereas, the vampires were the master race. But whereas Nick initially embraced that lifestyle, the humanity that he still retained was enough to drive a wedge between him and Lacroix. I mean, they were friends over the many centuries, but at the same time, they would clash more often than not as time went on, due to their differing ideologies. But another character who was a fixture of the show was the vampire Janette, as played by Deborah Duchesne. And she ran a vampire nightclub called the Raven, and on the surface, it was a your 90s typical 90s goth club, but the clientele for the most part was predominantly made up of vampires, with the occasional humans coming in here and there, not knowing the truth about the place. But Janette was someone who was somewhat of a frenemy of Detective Knight, in a sense that the two of them butt heads as well over the conflicting ideologies. But for the most part, though, she stayed on the friend side. Like, she stayed as a friend to Nick, and at times there was even a bit of a romantic interest between the two, because they had been lovers in the past. And so Janette had actually ran with Nicholas Knight and Lacroix back all those years ago, and they were basically a trio of vampires that were traveling the world and causing all sorts of havoc, while at the same time seeing all sorts of historical events. And that was another appeal of the show. And much like the TV series Highlander, there were several flashbacks that went from the present, to various points in Nick's past. And so, you saw him having interacted with, people from, long ago. And, at one point he even, for example, he met Joan of Arc of all people. And so, oftentimes these interactions were with people that would turn out to be, famous historical figures or infamous historical figures. And other times it was just, hey, these were ordinary people from way back in the day. But in some ways, these flashback stories would kind of go hand in hand with the stories in the present. And so the show actually did a very good job of balancing two genres, that of the cop show and then the gothic vampire show, and it basically merged them together. And it was a rather unique show as a result. And the cult following that the show has, is considerable. And after having seen the series from beginning to end, I definitely consider myself a fan of the show as well. But the first two seasons, I think the show was probably at its best because, you had a group of, characters that, you got to know, and, the actors did a good job of, playing them and working with the writers and, the production team to develop the characters. And as a result, these characters, both humans and vampires, became very much fleshed out individuals that we cared about, or at the very least we became invested in them. And so there was also genuine chemistry amongst the actors. Of course, with the first episode or so, there was a bit of a rough patch because everyone's trying to find their footing. But going from there, the main cast of characters, the crew of actors that played the characters were tight and firing on all cylinders. And so one of the differences between, say, season 1 and season 2 was that the captain of the police department changed between seasons 1 and 2. In season 1, you had the character of Captain Stonetree as played by actor Gary Farmer, and he was actually a pretty likable character in the sense that he had a dry sense of humor, and he had sort of a seen it all, done it all mentality with all his years working in the police department. And while he definitely considered Nick to be a strange cat, he couldn't deny that Nick got some results. And so basically, he was willing to overlook some of Nick's eccentricities, but at the same time, even he had his limits as far as, breaking the rules and what have you. And so he also had to, take Detective Skanky to task a few times for that as well. But for the most part, he kind of looked the other way and kind of, let them, engage in whatever shenanigans they needed to in order to get the job done, because they worked well together, as much of an odd couple as they were. So Gary Farmer's Detective Stonetree, was a, good. He did a good job of playing that particular character, and you believed him as being a figure of authority. But going into season 2, the Captain Stonetree was written out. I don't remember if Gary Farmer quit or he just, was let go from the show. I don't know for sure, but his character was written out, and the new captain was one Amanda Cohen, as played by actress Natsuko Ohama. I hope I'm saying her name right. And she was a lot more professional in her capacity as the captain of the police department, and she basically didn't put up with the BS that Nick and Skanky would often, throw at her in order to, say, buy some time for whatever case they were working on. Like, she wanted things done by the book. And she, while she had kind of a serious personality, she wasn't without warmth or a sense of humor. And as the series the second season went on, her character actually grew on me. And, certain, people who are a part of the fan base, tend to, kind of go back and forth between, liking, Captain Stonetree or, liking, Captain Cohen. And, yeah, sorry, make sure I said the names right. But I personally liked them both. And so, while I missed Captain Stonetree in season 2, I did come to like, Captain, Cohen. And so with the first 2 seasons, I mean, you had some good stories that, on one hand took place in the present as well as in the past, with the flashbacks. But, it did a good job of, blending the genres of cop show and, gothic vampire show. And you had some, unique episodes, I mean, that, gave us some good commentary on things at times. And, or just basically, it was a fun experience, watching, the series, with seasons 1 and 2. I mean, there were some duds here and there, but for the most part, the seasons, were, good through and through. Like, when I reviewed seasons 1 and 2, I gave them both 4 out of 5 stars, with the caveat that season 2 actually had some great episodes, whereas season 1 was, for the most part, just good, so, but, okay, so going into season 3, I had heard that a lot of things had changed, and, and so I knew going in that things were going to be shaken up, but I'd heard that, season 3 was, the worst part of the series. I've heard that season 3 was terrible, and you should stop watching in season 2. And I also heard that season 3, itself wasn't bad. It's just that it had a really lousy season finale and series ending. And so, having watched season 3, I can honestly say that it's not a bad season, and there are some genuinely good episodes in here. And, some of the new characters that come in actually become, characters that, the audiences, care about. Or at least in my experience, I actually came to care about them and like them. Or, in other words, certain new characters grew on me. While I did miss certain old characters, from seasons 1 and 2, but the new characters from season 3 did grow on me. But I will say, though, that there were episodes in here that, if not outright bad, were more or less kind of, they felt like filler. I mean, I didn't really have that problem a whole lot with seasons 1 and 2. I mean, sure, there were some duds, in both seasons, but for the most part, the seasons were consistently good. And even the duds, at the very least, felt like they were advancing, this story in this, dark yet, beautiful nightly universe. But with season 3, when you had the episodes that were more or less filler, or at the very least they came across as filler to me, I mean, it really did just feel like filler. I mean, with a few exceptions, they didn't really seem to add anything, or at the very least, they didn't add much, to the lore of the series, or any lore that was added in these filler episodes. It didn't really feel like anything urgent, or if, the ideas were good, it's just that, the episodes that, these ideas were introduced in, or these stories were, told in, just weren't that good. So, but to be fair, though, it's kind of balanced out with the fact that some of the best episodes of the series are in this season. And so, like I said, it's not a bad season, and I would even say it's a legitimately decent one, if not good, like seasons 1 and 2 were. But unfortunately, though, the very last episode of the series, while not the worst thing I've ever seen, is a major letdown, because it's basically, a very blunt ending, to the whole story. And, and the way it's done, I can understand why a lot of people got pissed off, when the series ended the way it did, because, I mean, prior to the last episode, I mean, the season, had, the people in season 3 had basically, found their footing, and, and you could, tell that, they were getting into the swing of things. And so, and even say, like, the very next to last episode of season 3 was very well done. But come the very last episode, that's when things just kind of, get yanked out from under you, or the rug gets yanked out from under you, and you're left with this sort of, I guess you could say, empty feeling, because you're kind of like, that's it? It's that kind of ending. But, so, while it's probably the least favorite of the 3 seasons of the show, I'm not going to say it's a bad season, and I even enjoyed it, just not as much as I did 1 and 2. But at the same time, I don't regret watching it. But I do think that the 3rd season's reputation may have been improved had the season finale been much better than it was. So, okay, so having given y'all some background on the series, let's go ahead and get into the synopsis. But okay, so things start off with a 2-parter called Black Buddha, wherein the main characters from seasons 1 and 2, Detective Skanky and Captain Cohen, are both killed in a bombing on an airplane that they're both on. And it turns out that this bombing is the result of this basically a mad bomber, right? But it turns out, though, that there was also a cursed statue, called the Black Buddha, that was present on the plane as well. And this statue, has basically been followed by bad luck wherever it ends up. And so there's some ambiguity as to, was it the Black Buddha that basically, caused all these events to, click together, to where everyone on the plane died, including, the characters of Skanky and Cohen, or was it just the mad bomber and the presence of the Black Buddha was a coincidence? But the Black Buddha, survives intact. But there's also a survivor, from the plane crash, who was, let's see, I can make sure I got the names right. Javier Vachon, who was played by Ben Bass. And it turns out this guy is a vampire, and that's why he was able to, heal up the way he did, whereas everyone else died in the crash. But he actually comes into contact with a newcomer. Let's see. Sorry, give me a sec. Detective Tracy Vetter, as played by Lisa Ryder. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of the names here, and some of the stuff I have committed to memory, some of it I kind of have to look at the notes for. So apologies if I glance at the notes here and there. But okay, so Detective Vetter is actually the daughter of a very prominent police official, and basically he's kind of been a helicopter parent to her. But she's trying to kind of, find her own way in the police force. And so on this particular night of all nights, I mean, not only is she, working with, a crime scene involving a high body count, but she ends up, finding out that vampires exist by way of meeting Vachon. And he tries to actually do away with her memory of the whole event. Like, he tries to hypnotize her into forgetting, which that's one of the abilities vampires have, is to hypnotize people. But it turns out, though, that he's so weak from his injuries that his hypnosis doesn't take on her, and so, or take with her. And so he reluctantly lets her in on the whole vampire world. And the two of them, they sort of have this friendship that blossoms into a romance. And it's kind of like the relationship that Detective Knight has with Dr. Lambert, in a sense that, someone from the police department, is aware of the existence of vampires and is trying to keep this one particular vampire's existence a secret from everyone else, So it's interesting because, after this, case is solved and, they are able to deal with the Mad Bomber, Vetter and Knight, like, they interact with each other and they even work together, but she's unaware that he's a vampire, and he's initially unaware that, she knows about vampires. And so it's like he's trying to keep his vampiric nature a secret from her, while she's trying to keep, her awareness of vampires a secret from him and everyone else. And so there is some interesting, back and forth in that regard, sort of like a tennis match of secrets, So, with this, new dynamic, I mean, things are, changed up to where, I mean, the deaths of, Skanky and, Cohen are, definitely, mourned, and their losses are, felt, with, the whole police department, especially the, the main characters of Detective Knight and Dr. Lambert, but they, end up also having a new captain by the name of Joe Reese, as played by actor Blue Mankuma. I hope I'm saying his name right. But he's, very much a, by the book individual for the most part. But at the same time, he's, not without, say, an emotional attachment to certain cases. And so basically, he's not above, for example, getting personally involved in a case, say, wherein, someone from his past, resurfaces, like, say, a killer that, he had tried to put away, comes back, that kind of thing. But for the most part, though, he's, very much, by the book, wants his team to get the job done, doesn't put up with, any BS, or, he puts up with as little BS as possible. But eventually, though, I mean, all these characters, they have their own chemistry with each other. And you also have a couple of, vampire characters that get introduced. I mean, some new ones. You have, for example, this, vampire named Screed, who's a friend of Vachon, and the two of them actually, ran together back in the day. And, Vachon, I mean, he's, more along the lines of, Detective Knight, in the sense that, he tries to avoid drinking human blood because he too has, grown a conscience over the years. But you also have, with Screed, the fact that he prefers to drink blood from rats. And so, I mean, there's some, gruesome yet comical moments with his character because of that. But you also have the character, let's see, Urs, as played by Kristen Lemon, and she shows up in a couple of episodes, and enough to where she's established as a fixture of the Raven nightclub, and also she's established as having been romantically involved with Vachon back in the day, as well as having been friends with Screed. And so you have, some new, characters here and there. And as the season goes on, I mean, the first few episodes, I mean, everyone's still trying to find their footing, and the stories themselves are kind of filler, but, a few episodes in, things get better as far as, we actually get some good stories. But the standouts for me were, Of course, Black Buddha. While it did piss me off that Detective Skanky and Captain Cohen were killed off, because I really did like their characters. Um, the two-part episode was actually pretty good, and it was rather suspenseful at times. What with the Mad Bomber's plans, and there was also the interesting idea of having a vampire who was Native American being involved, because it turns out that Vachon had actually been a conquistador back in the day, and you find that out. And the two of them had been old enemies, and they end up actually working together along with Detective Knight and Detective Vetter as well, in order to foil the Mad Bomber's plans. And so that was a rather interesting dynamic there, because with Vachon and the Native American vampire, you had these two mortal enemies having to put their differences aside to help save the day, or save the night, as it were. But from there, though, I mean, you had episodes like Blind Faith, which had the very fascinating idea of something other than a human becoming a vampire, namely this blind police dispatcher who is mugged one night, but it turns out that her guide dog was actually attacked by a vampire, and he and the dog actually becomes a vampire. And so you have this rather fascinating idea that on paper sounds ridiculous, but the way they do it in the show, I mean, you almost see the dog with the dog seems to have an almost human personality as it becomes a vampire, because much like someone who's newly turned, I mean, you see the dog going through, say, cravings for blood, and basically being disgusted with food that it used to eat, because blood is the only thing it wants, but it doesn't understand what's going on with it. And also its vulnerability to sunlight comes up. But this whole time, though, it's trying to keep his owner, the blind dispatcher woman, it's like he's trying to keep her from finding out his secret, but at the same time, he actually ends up saving her life on more than one occasion. He actually tears the throat out of someone who attacks her. And so it was really a cool episode. I mean, like I said, on paper it sounds ridiculous, but the way they explore the idea of an animal becoming a vampire was rather fascinating and very well done. And I guess the animal trainers deserve credit too, because the dog did a good job of acting, as it were. Let's see. You also had My Boyfriend is a Vampire, which was actually kind of a amusing satire of late night television talk shows. And it was kind of like imagine if, say, the Maury Show or the Jerry Springer Show. Oh, Jerry Springer. We'll go with Jerry Springer since this is the 90s. I mean, imagine, say, if the Jerry Springer Show had a sort of a dark side to it, in a sense that a body count was involved, and somehow involving vampires. And so it was an amusing episode, especially if you've seen the Jerry Springer Show back in the day. So it was kind of a flashback in that regard. But at the same time, I did like the satire it had of late night television and what have you. But they also managed to tie it together with what was going on in the main characters' lives at that point. But you also had one of my personal favorites, Hearts of Darkness. And this one actually dealt with a woman who had multiple personalities, three to be specific. But it turns out that one of her personalities is actually a vampire, whereas the other two personalities are human, which, kind of makes things, more than a little confusing for, the police, trying to solve this particular murder case that she's involved in, because, for example, I mean, when she's a vampire, of course, I mean, Nick picks up on the fact that the vampire's been at work, but when she's human, though, there's no sign of her being a vampire. Like, sunlight doesn't hurt her, crosses don't hurt her, when she's, human, like when her, two other personalities are in control. And so when you see her vampire side, come out to play, so to speak, that's when, you see just how aware she is of everything. Like, she's kind of the dominant personality, whereas the other two are just kind of along for the ride at this point. So, a very fascinating episode, and I forgot the actress's name who played her, but she did a really good job of, playing all three personalities, and, you kind of felt for her in the predicament she was in, but seeing, the idea of, I mean, multiple personality disorder is something that's fascinating in and of itself. I mean, maybe not for the person going through it, but, for those on the outside looking in. But you throw in, a vampire personality, like one that physically turns the person into a vampire when it's in control. Very fascinating stuff. But you also have, let's see, Let No Man Tear Asunder, which involves a black market, organ harvesting operation, and Dr. Lambert actually, becomes very close to being the next victim of this particular operation. And one of the reasons I like this episode was that while the people who were running the thing, were definitely evil. I mean, and they didn't care anything about, the people they were, killing in order to get their organs and what have you. On one hand, of course, I mean, with, Dr. Lambert being in danger, I mean, they did a good enough job of, say, making you as a viewer, question, whether or not, Dr. Lambert was going to survive the end of the episode. I mean, she's like that close to death, at that point, or to being killed, by one of these people. And so deep down, that she's going to survive, but at the same time, there's enough suspense to where you're like, that's pretty close, But also the fact that the main antagonist actually has a sympathetic reason for what she's doing. Like, it's still wrong, but when you find out why, she's, put this operation together, I mean, you can understand, why she's doing what she's doing, and you feel for her in that regard. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's like, hey, you still got a lot of people killed through your operation. So that was a rather, interesting episode to me. But another good one was Night in Question, wherein Nick gets shot in the head, and so I mean he's hospitalized, like he's in a coma, and I mean there's very real danger there, because I mean you got a vampire being examined by doctors. And you got Lacroix having to step in and use his hypnosis on the doctors to make them forget that they saw anything strange. And Dr. Lambert actually has to work with Lacroix to basically come up with a plausible story as to why Nick survives a head wound. But it turns out, see, that while he does survive the head wound due to his vampiric healing abilities, it does enough damage to him to where he gets amnesia. And as a result, he basically has a very human personality that, I mean, is very jovial, very likable. And, it's fascinating seeing, Geraint when Davies, play Nick as someone who has no idea who he is, but is, wanting to, trust, the people that are around him. For example, like, Dr. Lambert, he doesn't remember her, but, but he comes to, like her and see her as a friend. And it's obvious that, she's, really trying to help him here. But, she talks to a couple of the other characters and, saying that, hey, it's possible that, with him not remembering he's a vampire, I mean, we might be able to get him to where, he doesn't want or need blood. And so, and they even get him to actually eat human food, which he's done before, but only sparingly. But this time, though, with, him having no memory of having been a vampire, I mean, he just thinks he's an ordinary guy and, chows down on ordinary human food. And, and it's looking very promising. But unfortunately, though, the physical toll, of, being a vampire, it comes into play in the sense that sunlight and Nick, unfortunately, still don't go well together. And so when he's exposed to sunlight, I mean, he starts burning and what have you, and he has no idea what's going on. And so that's when, Dr. Lambert has to, reluctantly explain to him that you're really a vampire. And I really like this episode because, the whole, idea of, a vampire having amnesia, like to a point where they literally forget that they're a vampire, is fascinating, enough. But then you have, a, character that, we've, watched, from like for 3 seasons, right? That we've come to, care about and be invested in. Being the one going through this, it makes us, care about the situation that much more. And I honestly think that this is, one of, Geraint when Davis's, best episodes in terms of, say, straight up acting, because, he does a good job of initially, playing himself, right? But then after the head injury, I mean, he has this very innocent persona, not like smarmy innocent, but just like naive innocent, because, I mean, yeah, I mean, he's just like a new person, and he's very friendly too. And so it's cool seeing, Nick get to play that. But when he starts to pick up on the fact that there's something wrong, like, I mean, he's able to eat human food, but there's a craving that starts, to make its presence known, and, the craving for blood, right? But he has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know why he's got this craving all of a sudden, and he doesn't know what he's hungry for. It's just, it won't go, it gets to a point where it won't go away. It's not, say, overwhelming initially, but it starts to become stronger, and you see him, kind of go through, this transformation, of, hey, a guy who's just kind of, enjoying, himself, enjoying his day, and then suddenly, grappling with this unexplainable, ill feeling. But when he's exposed to sunlight, though, that's when I think, Geraint when Davies does a good job of, portraying, the horror of the situation, because here's a guy who has no idea he's a vampire, and he has no idea, why he's experiencing these, strange urges. And then when he tries to go for a walk in the sun, I mean, he nearly gets killed, and the terror that his character is feeling is very palpable. And I thought that Geraint when Davies did a good job depicting that. And so when he gets his memory back, I mean, it's inevitable, right? But at the same time, you're kind of like, you're hoping against hope that there's some way that he can keep this optimism that this amnesiac identity brought to him. But unfortunately, though, with the knowledge that he's a vampire, everything comes back, and it's like he was close to something, but then he kind of lost it. But at the same time, it does create some new angles for Dr. Lambert's, research into finding a cure for Nick's vampirism. So there's that. So yeah, Night in Question, definitely one of my favorite episodes of the season. Another good one was Sons of Belial. So for the most part in the series, when it comes to the supernatural side of things, we've dealt almost exclusively with vampires. Now, we do have the occasional cursed artifact, or at the very least an artifact that's touched by magic, perhaps, but we've almost dealt exclusively with vampires on the supernatural side of things. But here, though, we actually deal with a demon. And what ends up happening is, Nick ends up on the wrong side of an exorcism. Like, he's actually, just observing, this one particular, session, for this case that, he's working on, wherein, this one particular exorcist, works with people to exorcise, demons from them, people who are struggling to, function, from day to day because they literally have demons in them. And, this guy, expels them, right? But something goes wrong with this one particular exorcism, and Nick ends up becoming possessed by the demon. And, it gets to a point where, Lacroix, steps in, to, try and, save his, immortal frenemy, right? But unfortunately, this demon ends up, proving, more than Lacroix himself can handle. And so Lacroix has to very reluctantly work with the exorcist to, banish the demon from Nick. And ironically, some of the tools of exorcism include, crucifixes and, if I remember correctly, holy water. And so, definitely crucifixes. I mean, but basically a lot of religious imagery that are, anathema to vampires. And so you have both Lacroix and Nick, being tortured, by the presence of these religious artifacts or religious items, if you will, and the exorcist is just trying to, do his job and, expel the demon. But here he is not only having to, struggle with, a powerful demon possessing someone, but he's also having to contend with the fact that he's now, having to work with a vampire to help another vampire. And so, I mean, it's a really fascinating conflict there, and, seeing Nigel Bennett as Lacroix in this particular situation, he does a good job because, I mean, here he is, trying to be his, immovable, self. I mean, like, nothing, stops him usually, or he just walks through things, but here though, I mean, even he's, put in a position where he's in danger, because, I mean, this is beyond his capabilities to deal with him by himself. And so seeing Lacroix in a position of weakness and having to, work with, someone who is on the side of, say, faith, something that opposes vampires, was very fascinating to see. And also, Geraint when Davies does another good job of, portraying Nick going through a horrific situation, in a sense of him being like, physically held captive, by this demon. Like, he gets to where he has little to no control over himself. And so, another good, performance by him in that regard, because he's like trying to fight this, demon within him. And yet at the same time, I mean, it's like when you see him, contorted in agony and everything, I mean, pretty spooky stuff. But yeah, Sons of Belial, that was a good episode. And I liked seeing how, in the flashback that the episode has, it deals with, a time wherein, it was during the Spanish Inquisition, and Lacroix and Nick were, both, taken prisoner. And, at first you're thinking that, the prisoners are, just being needlessly tortured by the Inquisition, but then it turns out that one of the prisoners is possessed. And so ironically, you have a situation that you're initially thinking that, okay, the only monsters in the room are, Nick and Lacroix, right? But then it turns out when one of the prisoners is possessed by a demon himself, it's kind of like, oh, this is an awkward situation. And so you have, you have monsters, fighting monsters in both, the flashback and the present. So, yeah, pretty good. And, okay, so another standout was, and this is kind of a fan favorite episode, but it's called Fever. And imagine, for example, if you have a potential, treatment, for HIV, and a vampire gets a hold of it. Well, what ends up happening is a rat that was a part of this experiment, gets loose, and Screed, the rat-devouring vampire we've come to know and love, ends up, taking a bite out of this particular rat, and unfortunately ends up inadvertently, spreading a plague, and this plague is exclusive to vampires. And so you have the AIDS epidemic, which is terrifying in and of itself, and they actually touch on that in the episode. Like they talk about the impact that it's had on people, and you see like this one particular character who is an ordinary human, right? But he's been dealing with the disease, and you see the toll that it's taken on him, and it's really sad, right? But then when it goes to the vampires, though, you're basically seeing them experiencing something akin to the AIDS epidemic, except through feeding on blood and what have you. And it's really fascinating because even though it's one episode, there is an impact that is left by it, because you have the vampires coming very close to being wiped out by this disease, or by this scientifically created cure that ends up becoming a disease for vampires. And you have, Lacroix, contemplating, his mortality in a rather serious, moment for his character, as played by Nigel Bennett. And you have one of the bleakest Nightcrawler monologues that Nigel Bennett delivers as Lacroix, in that particular episode, because, here he is a vampire, and he's supposed to be beyond death, and now having to contemplate the possibility that, he could, die tomorrow because of this, plague. And unfortunately, there are certain, vampiric characters that buy the farm in this episode, and so you definitely feel the impact, that this plague has. And so, Fever was definitely a standout in that regard, in the sense that, it was very topical for the time, but it also, had a new layer of horror. It's like horrifying the horror, right? But let's see. Dead of Night was another one I liked, because it was another bit where it touched on another form of the supernatural, besides vampires, and it dealt with, say, a haunted house. And you see how some of the characters, when they're trying to solve a case involving this haunted house, you see a couple of them actually interacting with ghosts of people that they knew from certain times in their lives, and you see them being racked with grief and guilt for maybe not doing something or doing something, depending on the situation. or doing or not doing something. Like maybe they were in a position where they could have saved someone, or they could have stopped someone from doing something, and it just didn't work out, and as a result they're being haunted by certain things. So it's interesting in that regard, like another supernatural angle like that, wasn't exclusive to vampires. And another standout was the human factor, where the character Janette returns, because at the beginning of season 3, you come to find that she's left Ontario, and she doesn't want anyone to follow her, and she gave Lacroix ownership of the Raven nightclub. And he was telling Nick, don't try to find her, she doesn't want to be found. But she ends up resurfacing in this particular episode, and you come to find that the reason that she's disappeared for this whole season up to this point is because she had actually met and fallen in love with a human who had a child of his own, right? And she became basically a part of their family, and she came to realize that if she made love to him, and basically if she was with someone and the two of them like really loved each other, and something about the chemistry basically started to turn her into a human, because the more they made love, the less vampiric she became, to a point where one day she was an ordinary human once more. And I mean, granted, she had all the memories she had of her lifetime as a vampire, but she wasn't a vampire anymore. And so when Nick finds out, Nick and Dr. Lambert find out about this, I mean, they're both like, okay, we need to take some notes here, because I mean, this puts a whole new spin on the whole search for a cure for vampirism, right? And so it's really cool seeing Deborah Duchesne back in the role as Janette, because she was a fan favorite, and she was one of my personal favorite characters, and her presence was sorely missed. And so it's really cool seeing her again, and her latest development not only adds to her character, but it adds to the lore of vampirism as well. But unfortunately there is a tragic ending to the episode. I won't say anything beyond that. But so it was one of those things where it was good to see her again. It was good to see the character of Janette again, but there's not necessarily a happy ending to her story though. So let's see. The two other episodes I liked were Jane Doe and Dust to Dust. So Jane Doe, I think I enjoyed it because it went a long way towards giving some substance to the character of Captain Joe Reese, as played by Blue Mancuma. And in this particular episode, he's going after this serial killer who got off on a technicality or two. And this particular guy, I mean, he's become like a celebrated author, and sort of like giving readers an inside look to how evil works and everything. And basically he's saying he's innocent of all these crimes and what have you. The thing is, he's kind of like got these Nazi beliefs, and so basically he's been murdering black women for a number of years. And Captain Reese in the past was the one who caught him and put him in jail, but because of certain technicalities coming into play, the guy was let go. And so when Reese sees this killer making a career of his twisted crimes, while at the same time saying that he's innocent, it really pisses him off. And so you see Reese, who's in a position of authority, coming very close to abusing that authority in order to, pursue this killer. And the guy who plays him, I forgot the actor's name, but he was also in the movie Screamers. And so it's interesting because Screamers was a Canadian production, and here's that particular actor on a show that's being filmed in Canada and isn't set in Canada. So Canadian connection, right? But anyway, the guy who plays him is a very good actor, and he did a good job of playing a very evil individual, and someone that whether he was the one who was behind this current spate of killings or not, this guy had done some twisted shit, and so you wanted to see him stopped at the end of the day. And I really came to sympathize with the character of Reese, because he'd become a fixture of the show at this point in season 3, but this was, I think, one of the times wherein we actually saw him as a human being with both strengths and weaknesses. Like, you caught a glimpse of it in the episode Dead of Night, the haunted house episode, because he too sees someone that was dead, but is a ghost now, or he sees the ghost of someone from his past as well. So you catch a glimpse of a more human side of him in that particular episode, but it doesn't deal with it a whole lot. It deals more with the characters of Nick and Vetter. But in this particular episode, in Jane Doe, the reason it's called Jane Doe is that the killer is mutilating the women in such a way, to where, finding their identities is next to impossible. And to add insult to injury, he shoots them in the face, with a shotgun after killing them, mind you. But basically, he wants to make sure that there is no way that they're able to, physically reconstruct, these women. So a very sick bastard, right? And so, seeing, Joe Reese, being in a position where, he's like, he's a captain of the police department, but at the same time, the very human rage is taking control, and we understand why. But it was fascinating seeing Blue Mancuna portray this type of situation for his character, and I thought he did a pretty good job, and it definitely made him feel like a more fleshed out individual. But I will say that Nick ends up working with him to solve the case, obviously, but also to keep him from crossing the line. And so it was a very believable performance, but I was also glad to see that hey, as close to the line as he comes to crossing it, he doesn't go all the way through with things, because of Nick's interference, right? So the episode Dust to Dust is a fan favorite because it deals a lot more with the past of Lacroix, and it turns out that he lived in the time of the Romans, right? And he had a daughter, but it turns out this daughter of his had become a vampire, and not only that, but she was basically wanting to gain the power of all the darkness that vampires have, like I guess you could say the collected evil that vampires have as a species. And she was on the verge of becoming something that was monstrous even by vampire standards, something that scared Lacroix. And Lacroix is someone that, like, he's all for, vampires being the dominant species on the planet. But, this was something, like his daughter, becoming, this, monster that was, more evil than vampires was something that scared even him, to a point where he basically has her entombed for, like about 1,000 years, I believe it was. And so, he had basically, refused to acknowledge her existence. I mean, that's how scared he was of her and what would happen if she got out, right? But unfortunately, though, she actually does get out, and she ends up, leaving a trail of bodies. I mean, mostly, vampires that, are, characters on the show that, some of which we've come to know. And Nick and Lacroix, you have to team up to defeat her. And it's a very tragic situation because, I mean, as evil as his daughter is, I mean, physically speaking, she's still just a child, but she has, the intellect, of something unholy and, purely evil. And so when Nick and Lacroix have to work together to kill her, I mean, they do what needs to be done, but you definitely see, Lacroix in a very vulnerable, state of mind, because, I mean, he, has to face the fact that, he's the one who, turned his daughter into a vampire in the first place, and as a result, indirectly led her, down this path of darkness to where she, ended up, becoming as evil as she was. And so in a roundabout way, it was his fault that this happened. And, he also realizes that, leaving her alive, will only further endanger, the vampire race as a whole. And so, when he goes through with a very extreme action in the episode, I mean, it hurts. I mean, for the fact that we've become invested in the character of Lacroix, throughout the series, because, I mean, he's a bad guy, but he's also, kind of, if not a good guy, at the very least, he does have some redeeming, qualities, like to a point where he's a bad guy that we've come to like. But here, though, I mean, we see him, facing, the consequences of his actions from so long ago. And at the end of the episode, we see, how this has affected him and how it's devastated him, what he's had to do in order to, save, vampire kind in general, but at the cost of the life of his daughter. And we see him in a very human light, because, he mourns his daughter and says her name for the first time in Lord knows how many years. And so it's a very, sad, ending to the episode. And it's a very moving, portrayal of grief by Nigel Bennett as Lacroix. And seeing Geraint Davies in this episode as Nick Knight, he offers a good performance too, because, you see how, I mean, he has this, love-hate relationship with Lacroix, but this is an episode wherein, I mean, initially, I mean, he's, furious, that Lacroix, kept, such, a threat to vampires a secret all these years and never once mentioned his daughter. But then at the very end of the episode, when he sees, what this has done to Lacroix, like as far as, what he has to do at the very end in order to, save everyone, I mean, he really understands how much of a toll that this has taken on Lacroix. And so you see, Nick, actually, being sympathetic to, someone that, he usually hates, or at the very least, someone that he doesn't like. And so it was a good episode. And I forgot who the actress was who played Lacroix's daughter, but she was really good because, I mean, she was a little kid, but she does a very good job of, doing like, say, Kirsten Dunst did in an Interview with the Vampire, the movie. But imagine that, but, just straight up evil in a child's body. So there you go. All right, so those are the episodes that, I really enjoyed, and those are the ones that basically made season 3 worthwhile to me. Those along with, say, the new characters. I really came to like the characters of Tracy Vetter, as played by Lisa Ryder, and Javier Vachon as played by Ben Bass. Because the two of them had good chemistry with one another, and you saw further lore being added to the world of vampires with his character, because you saw flashbacks that weren't exclusive to Nick's life or Lacroix's life, but another vampire's life now, and also seeing Vetter's story unfold, seeing her going from someone who was constantly being monitored by her father, who's a bigwig in the police department, and basically trying to make her own way in the police force, and becoming a part of the team. It was a pretty cool story arc for her character. And also the aforementioned bit where she's aware of vampires existing now, and she's trying to keep that fact secret from everyone else, whereas Nick's trying to keep the fact that he's a vampire secret from her. That was another good dynamic, and I thought that Lisa Ryder did a good job of depicting that whenever certain plot elements came into play that allowed for that. And Blue Mancuma, I think that his character, grew on me in certain episodes. I think that I preferred the characters of, Captain Stonetree or Captain Cohen, from seasons 1 and 2 respectively. But that's not to say that, Captain, Joe Reese, wasn't without his points as well. So yeah, his character did grow on me as well. And Catherine Disher as Dr. Lambert, Dr. Natalie Lambert, she's been consistently good, from season 1 all the way to season 3, and I liked seeing how she's becoming increasingly desperate to find a cure for Nick, mainly because there are so many points in this particular season wherein Nick comes this close to becoming human again. And so every time she comes close to success with him, she's having to go back to the drawing board because things don't work out, and you see that it's taking a toll on her. And also they go from the will they won't they to, oh yeah, yep, they are an item now. And so seeing Catherine Disher portray that turmoil with her character, and then finally basically her and Geraint and Davies having that chemistry with one another, and actually playing the characters as basically admitting to each other that yes, we love each other. It was really cool to see that, because that vibe was there from the beginning, but here though we really see it come to the forefront as the season goes on. And so yeah, of the characters that are still on the series at this point, Nick Knight, Dr. Lambert, and Lacroix, those three, they're still consistently good, or in Lacroix's case, evil and good, and so, or likably evil, I guess, in Lacroix's case. And I wish that Janette had a larger role in the season, but at the same time, in the episode that we did get to see her, it was cool seeing Deborah Duchesne play the character again, and she still was able to bring Janette to life. And I liked the bit that it adds to the vampire lore in general, but it would have been cool if she'd been in a few more episodes. I understand her character being written out as a main character, but it would have been nice to have seen her in more episodes than just one. So, excuse me. So, you have a good cast of characters, both new and old, being able to work together and have a good dynamic in the long run. And you have some genuinely good episodes and a couple of great ones too. So I will say that the episodes that were filler, tend to slow things down, to where it kind of goes, like a seesaw at times. Like, the filler episodes aren't bad per se. It's just that it feels like, okay, I mean, very little of substance was added to it, or the interesting, bits that added to, this, dark world that, the series takes place in. I mean, they were interesting, but it would have been better if, the episodes had focused more on those aspects as opposed to, say, the ho-hum story that the filler episodes were made up of, so, or excuse me, filler stories or ho-hum stories that the filler episodes were made up of. There we go. But yeah, so it was kind of like a balancing act. It'd go one way, go another. So you didn't quite know when you were going to get a genuinely good episode and when you were going to get a filler episode. Whereas with seasons 1 and 2, you consistently got good episodes, and so and occasionally a great episode comes season 2. Whereas with season 3, I felt like it was kind of inconsistent in that regard. Like, the good episodes were good, but then the ho-hum episodes were just kind of, well, that happened. And then, of course, you get to the very last episode, and I will say that in some respects, I can respect it for the fact that it brought a genuine end to the series, right? And it's one of those bits where no one leaves here alive. It's that kind of thing. So I can respect it in that regard for actually going to that route and sticking with it. But at the same time, though, it was done so abruptly that, you're really left feeling like that's it. That's how it ends. I mean, it's that kind of thing. So when you see the ending, you'll know what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's kind of like, there are people who are fans of the series that have come up with, various forms of fan fiction that either come up with a much better ending for season 3, or not only do they do that, but they actually continue, the series into, say, something like season 4, albeit through fan fiction, right? And so I need to check some of that stuff out. So, but it is fascinating to know that, I mean, yes, this, divisive season finale did happen, but, the fan base, I mean, they cared about the show so much that they literally worked together to come up with better endings for the series, or, in some cases, continuations of the series. But so yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give Forever Night season 3 out of 5 stars. It was actually a decent season, my least favorite of the 3 seasons, but at the same time still worth watching though. As far as extras go, I mean, much like seasons 1 and 2 before it, I mean, there's like little to no extras. Like season 1 had no extras, but season 2 had a couple of commentaries and an interview, a panel with Geraint and Davies. So season 2, it was like, okay, the people were kind of like, okay, people actually, like the people who put together, the DVD release of season 2 are kind of like, okay, this show actually has a pretty good following. We need to throw some extras in there. So they did. This was kind of like a compromise because there are some extras, but it's just in the way of 3 music videos. And so they are cool in the sense that if you've watched the series, it's really neat seeing how, the songs and the lyrics that the songs have kind of go hand in hand with the vampiric imagery that is shown in these music videos. And so I mean, they're cool music videos, especially in that sort of 90s time capsule way. But at the same time, considering that this was literally the end of the series, it would have been nice if there had been, like, maybe, say, a retrospective, looking back interview with some of the, cast members or something like that. Just to say, like, they can say, hey, I mean, we came, we saw, we conquered, right? But or something along those lines. But yeah, so that was season 3, and I'm very glad that I finally got to the point where I was able to watch the season and see how the series ended. And it was very fun watching Forever Night, and I very much enjoyed it, and I deeply enjoyed being taken into this dark yet fantastic world, or fantastical world of the night in Canada. And I'm definitely going to miss the characters of Nick Knight and Lambert and Lacroix and all them. And I'm definitely going to miss Nights at the Raven, because it's like anytime you watched the series, there'd always be a scene at the Raven. And it's like, if you've ever been to the Lizard Lounge, aka the church, I mean, back before COVID happened, I mean, you kind of got a feel for, like, wow, you're in a goth club, and it kind of feels like a vampire club too, And so when I finally got to watching the series, I mean, it made me think of the church, and so it brought back some good memories. And so with the end of the series, I mean, after having watched season 3 and knowing that this is the end of the series, I mean, it's kind of bittersweet. I mean, because on one hand, not a bad season, but at the same time, knowing that this is the end of the series, and the way the series ended, it's kind of like it could have ended better, but I'm glad I got to be a part of this world for a time, and anytime at the Raven nightclub definitely brought back some memories of hanging out at the church sometimes. So yeah, bit bittersweet, right? But there you go. That was season 3 of Forever Night. 3 out of 5 stars. So you made it this far with me. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen and check out my review. And I will put the links to my reviews for seasons 1 and 2 in the description for this video. So thank you very much for coming along with me for the ride. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you want to see more, let me know. So y'all take care. Good night. Bye.